praying about it was kind of awkward. You know, you prayed for illumination, but you're talking about wrestling between one brand of Christianity and another. So, you know, you're going to say, God, show me the way, and because you're not showing the other people the way. I mean, so it was less a matter of prayer than a matter of, so far as I can tell, the Holy Spirit working through other people and through my own mind. My father was a Reformed Church in America minister, so sort of classically Dutch Calvinist. So I was a child growing up in a rural German community in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, which was a great place to grow up. We had this big cemetery in the backyard, I mean, so we were really out there. So there was the church, the parsonage, and the cemetery. So I got to see the whole panoply of religious life. We lived there until I was 13, and we moved to northern Michigan, to another small town of 100. Then I took leave of there, went to a Dutch Calvinist college where I met my wife, and I thought I was going to be a Reformed Church in America minister, really. So I was on the pre-seminary track in college, you know. But I was a sociology major, and I was on my honeymoon, and I was starting to reread some of the books that I hadn't read in college, or I should have. They were assigned, but one of them was Habits of the Heart, which is kind of probably the most best-selling sociology book ever printed, which isn't saying much, I suspect. But it really was attracted to the sort of scholarly, sociological life. So I bagged the idea of going to seminary, which didn't actually bother my parents at all. I mean, they were very supportive of what I wanted to do. And I went to graduate school in 1994 in North Carolina. And it was 1996 when I met my first serious Catholic. So I was, 25? Before I think, or at least I was conscious of meeting my first serious Catholic, who remains a friend today. So 1996, all the way up to, when did we enter the church? I think it was 2011. That's a long time, right? And so most of that was off, right? I mean, there was a pattern. They sort of got interested, read about it for a while, talked to some people, and then bagged it for 6 months. So that was a pattern that lasted probably 5 or 6 years. But the first barrier fell in 1996 when I met this Catholic whose piety, personal piety, dwarfed mine, right? So I had to get rid of the idea that Catholics were universally unserious about their faith. I had thought so until that time. Not for any good reason, just because they were not in my social circles, really. Moved to Texas, to the University of Texas, for a faculty position in 2002. Sometime after I got here, I crossed Jay Budziszewski's orbit, and I could tell my graduate school advisor, Christian Smith, was talking Catholic several years before he converted with his family. But it probably wasn't until John Paul II passed away. And I really look at that as a turning point. And I think a lot of people look at John Paul II's life and ministry and legacy as sort of breeding lots of Catholics in some ways, including conversions. So when he died, I think it was 2005, I had been a sociologist of religion, which kind of meant sociologist of evangelical Protestantism, really. I didn't know that much about Catholicism, even though I purported to study American religion. I picked up a biography of John Paul II, and that was kind of the beginning of the more serious dialogue internally about what the church was about. So that was the beginning of the more intense cycle of thinking, reading. Praying about it was kind of awkward. You know, you prayed for illumination, but you're talking about wrestling between one brand of Christianity and another. So, you're going to say, God, show me the way, and because you're not showing the other people the way. So it was less a matter of prayer than a matter of, so far as I can tell, the Holy Spirit working through other people and through my own mind and intellectual activity. I also had snuck into Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago one time when we were visiting family, and picked up a book by Peter Kreeft, Catechism of the Catholic Church, kind of popularly written. Started working through that, and I remember thinking after I had read most of it that I'm on board with 93% of this. I don't know why I said 93, it wasn't everything. There were some significant things. One of the things I've noticed about converts is there's always something that's a barrier and something that's a big draw, and they can be very different for different people. So I think as a Dutch Calvinist, Mary was this big barrier to me, whereas for other converts, it's the key draw. I remember having lunch with Professor Budziszewski here at UT's campus, and every once in a while, and asking him questions about some of these crazy doctrines, like this perpetual virginity. Like, what's up with that? And why do people obsess about that? And the Immaculate Conception. Protestants usually think, oh, this is about Jesus. It's about Mary. What? So I would go and ask him, and he would give these remarkable explanations of the doctrine. And I remember I'd leave that lunch thinking, that's an interesting explanation, and being impressed at his ability to articulate in a way that was rational. And I would walk away thinking, well, I'm not on board with that, but that's a better explanation than I thought they had. So that happened with some regularity, and then I'd go away for months at a time. One of the things I found prevented me from moving forward and becoming Catholic was just sort of I don't know if it's Protestant momentum, like, you've always done this. It seems like a bigger problem to mess with it than to do it, right? So comes this point where, I'm on board with 93% of the stuff, or 95, or 96, which is a lot, right? So why don't you join? Well, you enter this sort of limbo stage where the pull of your existing evangelical life is still significant, and but the push forces out has just they've come to this equilibrium where you're just going to stay, right? So you need some sort of final pull or push to move it forward. The big push actually came in the form of my wife, who had not done the same kind of intellectual wrestling that I had. She's not an intellectual, which has worked out great in our marriage. She's more the mover of things. And so I recognized that I had been intellectually mulling this over for years, but never socially willing to move it forward. She sort of got tired of hearing me talk about this at some point. Christian Smith had converted in Easter Vigil of 2010 and had sent me a few manuscripts about this, and I really resonated with them. And so I would share them with my wife over dinner table, etc. And finally she got to the point where, Mark, if we're going to do something, let's do it, right? And I said, well, let's not talk crazy here. We have to be patient about this process, even though I had been very patient. And I was teaching a Sunday school class at the Presbyterian church we were at. And she had said one weekday in that summer, this Sunday I'm going to take the kids and we're going to go to the cathedral downtown, which is where Jay and Sandra Budziszewski had gone. We knew that, and we respected them. And I said, okay, I can't go, I've got to teach Sunday school. So I went and taught Sunday school, and wondering that morning, like, what is she going to think, right? I had never been to a Sunday Mass. I will say I had been to many, many midweek masses with the friend that I met back in 1996. When we would travel out of town for conferences, we'd often go to daily mass at 7 in the morning, and 5 or 6 people in the audience in some strange city. But I had never seen the beauty of a Sunday mass. I just hadn't. At one level, though, I was impressed with sort of the portability of the mass, right? I mean, this is something you can celebrate in a lot of different places. And you don't have to love the priest. The priest doesn't have to have great homilies or sermons, because the mass is not about the homily as much as it is about the celebration of the Eucharist. We had already come to that conclusion as Presbyterians, that the bigger deal was the Lord's Supper, not the sermon. And I think it had alienated us a little bit that evangelicals church shopped, and we had done that too at different times, and kind of just got sick of both it and didn't like the idea that there's something to shop for here. It was not supposed to be like that, right? So she went to Mass that Sunday and was stunned by the reverence of it and the beauty of it, the material beauty of it, materiality of Catholic worship, right? There's holy water, there's oils, there's bread and wine, incense. It appeals to the senses. And this is about, a God who became man, right? Who came down to earth and walked among us in the flesh in a material way, right? So she had a positive experience of that. I started going with her on Sunday mornings. That was August. Conveniently in September, they were starting up an RCIA class. So intellectually, I was on board, but socially, it was all too quick. So we started RCIA September of 2010, not because I think I needed convincing, but because I still needed some more time and getting to know the place. RCIA, is hit and miss in various places. And people, Catholic friends of ours always said, "How's your RCIA?" And it was fine. It was fine. And socially, I needed that time and the time to ask questions and just sit in church for several months. And that year, Easter was way out. It was like late April. I'm like, okay, good. I've got an extra month, too, to think about this stuff. Another turning point came, I think it was 2006. I was working on my first book. It was called Forbidden Fruit: Sex and Religion in the Lives of American Teenagers. And I was writing a chapter on what different American religious traditions said and thought about sex and marriage and family. Evangelical piece I could write pretty quick. Mormons, I had to inquire about that, read up about that. Interesting. The Catholic piece, what do the Catholics think about sex and marriage? And I knew they were against contraception and things like that, and I didn't know why. And I knew that they were against divorce. And I was always impressed with that, because I always thought my Protestant brothers and sisters often didn't take marriage seriously enough. And my own marriage, we had covenanted we threw away the key, take the nuclear option off the table, which made, fighting a lot less significant, right? Because you knew that you could squabble and still the thing was secure, right? So I was always impressed with their sort of position on divorce. But I didn't really understand the whole thing about sex and contraception and things like that. So it was after John Paul II had passed away, and I had picked up George Weigel's biography, that I thumbed through what John Paul II had talked about sex and marriage. And that's when I was introduced to the theology of the body. And just reading his short treatment of it was really impressive to me. I remember thinking the first 10 to 15 pages I had read about theology of the body kind of blew away what little evangelicals had been saying about this stuff for many years. So I got it pretty quickly, the essence of this, and then I started picking up John Paul II's stuff about theology of the body and elsewhere, and in other books of his. I'm no expert on it, and he's a pretty inscrutable guy to get through on that, so it helps to have interpreters. But I think it's a winsome thing. And at that point, I was writing that book, and I was still a Protestant for 4 more years. But at that point, I knew that the Catholics were right on matters of sex and marriage and how they thought about it. I wasn't there yet, but I knew that they were right and I was not. But it's part of that sort of 93% thing. They still had this obsession with Mary, and I couldn't get over that. In the end, it's kind of funny how Mary was a stumbling block. Why would Mary be a stumbling block? I get it, but this gentle servant, be it done unto me according to your will, do whatever he tells you. This is not really a stumbling block kind of character when you investigate her more thoroughly. But I was on board with theology of the body well before we became Catholic. It was winsome, and sociologically, I could see the effects of sort of the wide uptake of contraception on what I call the mating market, and how that has affected how people meet, and the rapid sexualization of relationships and things like that. So, and he did some shout outs to Pope Paul VI, who kind of held the line on contraception when there was pressure to get with the times, kind of thing. And looking back, it's just impressive that he had the foresight to see the world that contraception helped to bring about. So. I had equated kind of the Catholic position on contraception back to Paul VI's Humanae Vitae as being about personal usage of it, and they just have problems with personal usage. And I didn't care a hill of beans about people's personal usage at that point. What I cared about was I saw in sort of the wider mating market how people meet and fall in love and get married. I had seen its sort of effects. I mean, it slowed relationships down. Men were unwilling to commit. Women felt pressure to have sex before they might prefer to in a relationship. So he saw that coming. I mean, and it's somewhat logical, right? How this works, right? So even though individuals can opt out and say, I'm not going to do it that way, the wide uptake, not just of the actual use of the pill, but the mentality that sex and pregnancy really they don't really go together that much anymore, is widespread. And it affects how people think about the meaning of sex and the place of sex in relationships. So relationships become sexual quicker, I suspect, than they once used to, in part because to flirt with sex meant, somebody was going to get pregnant here pretty quick if we keep doing this. And then we're going to have to make a decision about, are we going to get married? So that world doesn't really exist anymore, because he has the power in some ways in the relationship to say, you need to get on the pill, right? Or she feels pressure to get on the pill, because if she withholds sex, he has more options in the local mating market. So she feels pressure to do this, and she feels competition from other women, right? In a way that prior to the wide uptake of contraception, she would not have felt competition from her peers, she would have felt solidarity with her peers, right? Because the cartel of women, so to speak, had each other's backs. And to sort of offer sex too early in a relationship was threatening to everybody, women, basically, in the community. So they had their own means of social pressure to sort of charge more, so to speak, in their relationships. But the wide uptake of contraception sort of undermines that, right? Women turn into each other's competition because sex no longer is predictably linked to pregnancy. Okay? So she got to control her fertility. He got charge of the pace with which relationships became sexual, much quicker than in the past. So that's kind of the grand bargain of contraception's uptake, and which is sort of somewhat distinctive from the intentions of the creators of it, right? So they intended it for married women who wished to have, say, 3 or 4 children instead of 5, 6, or 7. But there was no way in the American legal and cultural system that was going to be kept within marriage, and pretty rapidly it wasn't. So Paul VI saw that, right? There's a big upswell of interest in this newfound wonder pill, right? And he has to have the nerve to push back against it, and was widely criticized for that. Some of that comes back to sort of the authority structure, right? Which I had recognized well before we converted. You know, sola scriptura was a big deal as a Dutch Calvinist, right? And as a Protestant in general. I had lost faith eventually in my ability to figure out the Bible, right? I mean, I was a pretty decent armchair biblical scholar. You could span the books on my shelf and say, wow, this guy has read a lot about this stuff, right? But the more I read, the more I was convinced that you can make arguments for everything from the Bible, right? Some of them are going to be bad arguments, easily swept aside, but it was always going to be a matter of interpretation, right? And so at that point, I kind of wrestled with the idea of teaching authority and the idea of the magisterium, and concluded, with help, that Protestants had a magisterium. And some will call Luther and Calvin magisterial reformers, which is an accurate term, because they were the ones who had teaching authority. At the same time, sola scriptura kind of undermines the idea that there are particular human authorities in this, right? Everybody has a magisterium of a sort, even though they may not admit it. I look around at evangelical churches, and who's the privileged interpreter? It's the minister, typically speaking. In some mega churches, a lot of people listen to this and invest a lot of authority in a particular person's interpretation. They might privately dispute it, etc. But I came to realize that everybody's got a magisterium of some sort. And was I willing to sort of go with either my own teaching authority on this stuff or other people's? And at that same time, you know, I'm thinking about, I was Presbyterian, PCUSA. You know, every summer they would have an annual meeting and wrestle with major issues. And it just, at some level, it got to be ridiculous that things are up for grabs like this on an annual basis, right? And I had no confidence in my Presbyterian magisterium. So we dabbled with the Baptists for a year, and briefly with the Anglicans, very briefly, during this wrestling process over Catholicism, but came to the realization that everybody has a magisterium, and wow, wouldn't it be nice to have one that had some unbroken line back to the beginning of Christianity? So the idea of one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church made sense. I came to the realization that there were a lot of teachings of the Catholic Church that I was already on board with. So that this thinner veneer between heaven and earth made sense to me. Purgatory, which when I was younger would have been a ridiculous idea. I'd already come to terms with that, you know. The Baptist obsession with deathbed conversions, which is a good thing. I had a hard time believing, like, okay, so Uncle Joe, who lived his life entirely resistant to Christianity, is ready to stand in the presence of holy God because before he gasped his last, he prayed the sinner's prayer. I was glad he did. But I didn't believe, like, he's ready, right? I didn't believe I was ready, right? I mean, I was Calvinist enough to be very in touch with the depravity of my own heart and how even the process of sanctification takes time. Maybe God's willing and able to wipe it away in an instant, but there's a lot of unlearning that I ought to be doing in my life. And so it didn't strike me as odd that, you know, there's something like Heaven's Waiting Room, where you get washed up a little bit. I kind of came across that in C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce. That some people just aren't ready for heaven yet. And I started seeing it in the scriptures. Protestants are quick to sort of say, where is that in the Bible, right? I don't see the name purgatory. Well, it's not named there. But you get a sense from Paul where there's definitely a sense of, being saved as one escapes through the flames kind of thing, right? By the skin of your teeth, so to speak. And that, but without holiness, no one will see God. And I could affirm that even though I was saved, I wasn't very holy. I still know the depths of my depravity, right? And recognize that, like Father Barron says, the goal of life is to become more saintly, to work on one's sanctification, to work out one's own salvation. So that 93% thing, there was a moment after we started RCIA that it was after I had wrestled with and thought hard about sort of Catholic Church teachings on marriage and family and sexuality. I thought, wow, they're right on this stuff. About the rest of it, trust your mother, right? That the idea came, trust your mother church in some ways. Like how, you can't always see how your parents are right about some things, but we say our kids, trust us, okay? I decided at that point that I needed to trust them on the 7% that I wasn't quite sure about, including their profound esteem for Mary. I probably will never be Marianist in the sense of really have this sort of passion for Our Lady, but I recognize that I don't have a problem with how the church esteems her anymore. I trusted them, and I grew in affection for her. And I realized that a lot of the things I thought about, what Catholics thought about Mary, were not true. Or where they are true, where people have sort of an idolatrous worship of her. I mean, the church doesn't affirm that, right? They're careful about what they say, right? So it's not what the church teaches that is outrageous, it's what people think the church teaches. That's the outrageous thing, right? And I had come to realize that I had been buying into myths about the church rather than accuracies. Once you sort of look into the accuracies, the myths lose some of their power.